current recession and the Reserve Bank cutting growth forecast, experts say the country may need a loan from the IMF. But its remedy for Greece and Portugal during the Eurozone crisis was reduce public spending, cut salaries and benefits, insist that state-owned enterprises return to the private sector, and reduce minimum wages and restrict collective bargaining. So will this be a good solution for us here in South Africa? To find out more and to look at the IMF's influence on African countries specifically, we're joined in studio by Tapiwa Chadia Diamond, an independent Afro expert. Thank you so much for joining us. Also with us in Cape Town is Misheck Mutize. He's a lecturer in finance at the University of Cape Town. Misheck, thank you so much for joining us this morning, because I'm sure our viewers would have watched the news, the latest statements coming from the IMF over the last few days, and really scratched their heads trying to make sense of what this actually means. Maybe I'll start with you, Tapiwa. These latest comments from the IMF, making these statements, I read it and I thought, okay, but tell us something that we don't know. What was your reaction?
Well, it's the normal reaction. What basically the IMF has said is they've told us the things that we already know in terms of the fiscal policies, in terms of what needs to be done within South Africa. So the diagnosis that they've given now is what the government is also currently trying to do. You understand? So there isn't much difference in terms of what the country is actually doing in terms of having an economic resuscitation. But of course, we are cognizant of the fact that IMF has got a deep interest in South Africa. But South Africa is part and parcel of the BRICS, which is in direct conflict, which comes in as an alternative to the IMF, you understand? So, and also to understand, what is important to understand is that the policies, for example, the economic structure adjustment programs that the IMF gives to all the countries, whether in Africa or anywhere in the world, they have not worked. They've got a one policy documentation for the economic structure adjustment program, which just doesn't work. It has never worked anywhere in the world. If we look at the history books, it has never worked. Whichever country that has been in contact with IMF, now it is very dependent on the monies from IMF. So the best thing for South Africa to do is to stay away as possible from the IMF. It's what they've done currently for the past 23 years. Remember when the old dispensation signed to get a loan from the IMF in 1993, about 5 or 6 months after, the ANC, the new dispensation, refused that debt because they understood that the policies, that the fiscal policies that the IMF would give South Africa would not be good for the people, for the poor people in South Africa. And my learned colleague is very articulate in those areas.
Now, Misheck, the influence and the opinion of the IMF, do we give too much weight to it? Should we be sitting up and putting our shoulders back and saying, well, if the IMF says we must do it, then so be it? What is your opinion?
Well, the IMF does not bring something new at the moment. It's just that its voice has become more solid and has more power. But if you look at the discussion, what it is raising now is what we have consistently been raising, that the issues that needs to be fixed, let them be fixed now when they are still within the control of the country's fiscus and also the monetary policy, before we submit ourselves to the IMF or other multilateral lending institutions. So what it says now, it has no power to control it, but it's within the country's fiscus and the governing party to implement the reforms that are needed to make sure that we don't slide into the debt trap that will force us to bow to the power of the IMF. So for now, it has no power or influence.
What about the alternatives to the IMF? Obviously, a lot of noise was being made around the so-called BRICS Bank, but nobody always knows what exactly is going on there. There's the influence of the Chinese and whether it's better to take a loan from them. What are the alternatives to the IMF?
Well, considering the new development bank under BRICS as an alternative, it is a good alternative. But remember, there are also issues that it has not yet been fully capitalized to support the structural deficits in these countries. But as for now, I've always reiterated that the problem that we have in South Africa is not purely financial in nature. It is structural, that if it's fixed now, we can avoid seeking support from outside. So the new development bank, of course, it could be a good alternative to consider rather than the IMF. But looking at the interlinks that we have also between the new development bank and the IMF, it could be of the same nature.
Tapiwe, your opinion, is that a workable alternative to the views always expressed and the pressure being put out there by the IMF?
I've always believed in having African solutions for Africans. It goes back now into the issue of the African Renaissance, where we say, us as Africa, we've got all the resources that we need within Africa. So we need to have a way and means of turning around ourselves, turning around the mineral resources that we have into mass production for Africa, to benefit Africa. Because what the problem now in Africa is that we've got a lot of imports from the products that come from the raw materials that we have, and it puts us in the back seat, right? So this now, with the IMF saying all the issues that they've raised thus far, is problems, like what my learned colleague is saying, is problems and issues that are currently being resolved by Africa. But of course, there is what I would term cognitive domination, to say these institutions in Wall Street, the IMF, the World Bank, they come into Africa, into countries which are in dire straits, and they speak to those countries because they've got a higher voice. And when they speak, they expect countries to react based on whatever they would have said. But that is not always the solution in terms of, for instance, Africa. And I believe Africa can have its own solutions by having its own institutions.
Now, let's look at an example. You are here as our Afro expert. I was reading a little bit about Ghana. Earlier in the month, they said that they've been chipping away at the bailout that they received a few years ago from the IMF, and that they'll very soon be rid of it, and thank the IMF for their support and that kind of thing. The IMF would point to Ghana and say, you see, here's an example of a country that took our help and took our advice, and look where they're standing right. What can you tell us about the situation in Ghana in comparison?
Okay, the situation in Ghana is a little bit different. We have seen that Ghana has refused more debt, right? And they have been, of course, trying to get out of it, but they're not completely out of it. As an example, probably I would pose to you to say, whatever debt that IMF gives to any country in the world, they say that debt cannot be used for investment. Let's say, for instance, for infrastructural development. That debt cannot be used for education purposes. That same debt cannot be used for anything in the country. So they tailor-make you to do certain policies that will make you go in deeper debt. So that has never been a solution. And I believe it's high time that Africa shuns away from the IMF because they become more dependent. If you look at what's happening in Malawi right now, they've been given more debt. If you look at what is happening in Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe is in dire straits in terms of the political crisis and the economic crisis that it has. It's because of those debts. They've got policies which can turn around the situations, but because of that, it's not easy for them to come out. Mozambique is in the same situation. We have Angola. We also have got Eritrea in the same pool where IMF says we are here to assist, but there's no track record of even one single country that has managed to do properly.
Now, Misheck, President Cyril Ramaphosa and the team that he's built around him, he's got this specific hub or team of economics and business experts that he's put together, and they've put these investment summits together and all of that. They would have read this report from the IMF and just said, can you just give us some time? Because the things like promotion of competition in all sectors in the economy, addressing governance issues and improving business models of the SOEs, they would say that this is all that they've been chipping away at over the last few months. But I suppose with the IMF speaking out about it, it seems that things are not changing fast enough. Then you've got the IMF also weighing in on a more political issue, saying that laws that allow for expropriation of land without compensation should be carefully considered and be guided, quote, by lessons of international experience. Those around the new president and trying to get the country's economic going again, would probably say to the IMF, stay in your lane. But do you think that things should be changing faster, and how is that possible?
It's very possible, would say it's very possible because it's within their power. But if you look at it, we can say the IMF should stay within their lane. But look, what they are saying is a real problem. Yes, we've got good plans, good stimulus packages, and we have come up with those plans so many times. But what lacks in the plans is the execution and the implementation, because it's either there is lack of willingness and lack of support and inconsistencies in the voices within the governing party, obviously for political reasons. But although they are a bit skeptical to implement this because of obvious the social pressure that comes with it and the pain that will be exerted on the population. And for the obvious political reasons, they are approaching the situation, which is a bit delicate here, with caution. But in the end, I've always said that even if you avoid to act now, you are only compounding the problem to be much bigger in the future. And you are only delaying the inevitable, because in the end, you find that the privatization that is being shunned now, it will happen, but at some point which might be too late, because they might not have so much power to influence the system in the end.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there for now. Obviously, a topic that we could speak about for hours. Gentlemen, I thank you both for your time. Tapiwa Chadia Diamond, an independent Afro expert with us here in the studio, as well as UCT lecturer in finance, Misheck Mutize, joining us from our Cape Town studios.